So, hello everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me and the organization of this wonderful workshop. I'm most delighted to be here today and to present and discuss my current research with you here at the Institute for Contemporary History. The title of this symposium asks about the significance of water for the surrounding ecosystems and the natural resources contained therein. From this question arises my thesis that extractive interventions affecting the water balance of a region can have far-reaching consequences for the people living and working there. For example, serious issues emerge when examining the ecological footprint of a reservoir. These include riverbed erosion, sediment deposition, salinization, CO2 emissions from decomposing plants, impaired water temperatures and flow rates, as well as the extinction of entire species in its catchment area. These issues can deeply damage the surrounding ecosystem. Equally dramatic are the social costs of industrial water management. Without the hydropower schemes, the water would flow through wells or irrigation systems, and a flooded valley can no longer be used as a hunting grounds, productive forest land, agricultural land, or as transit route. Therefore, in the following presentation, I would like to critically examine the social and environmental history of dam construction in the Alps. I focus on displacements that occurred in the post-war period in France, Switzerland, and Italy. I limit myself to these three countries of the Alpine arc because industrial hydropower was most extensively developed here during the 20th century. First, I will provide an overview of the global industrial water power history to highlight the diverse applications of hydroenergy in the 20th century. Second, I want to present the history of industrial hydropower in the Alps within its global historical context. Doing so will demonstrate the importance of the so-called white coal for the energy industry of the Alpine region during the age of high modernity. Third, as announced, I will delve into the social consequences of hydropower in France, Switzerland, and Italy. For this purpose, I will present the three case studies of Tignes, Reschen, and Marmorera. And in conclusion, I will put forth some summarizing thoughts to start the discussion. Although industrial hydropower became increasingly widespread from the late 19th century onwards, the global era of large-scale hydroelectric power plants reached its peak in the decades following the Second World War. Between 1950 and 75, an average of 1,000 dams were built each year. Political regimes of all stripes constructed 80,000 small and over 45,000 large dams in more than 140 countries, integrating approximately 2/3 of the world's rivers into industrial value chains. This enthusiasm for water infrastructure ended in the 1990s. In this period, only 250 dams were built per year. China invested the most financial, human, and natural capital in expanding its hydropower, followed by the United States and India, Japan, and Brazil closely standing behind. Furthermore, the Soviet Union, Spain, Scandinavia, Turkey, and Egypt also thought to maximize their industrial and agricultural production through their hydroelectric resources. Countries and private corporations did not just dam flowing and standing water bodies for power generation and storage. They also did it to irrigate agricultural lands, provide water to industries and households in arid regions, prevent floods, and even modernize entire river bassins using so-called multi-purpose dams. Hydropower also served the political objective of both democratic and authoritarian regimes. These dams, often seen as modern temples or pyramids, embodied the promise of a prosperous and self-reliant future in the energy sector. They also played a role in mitigating economic crisis and acted as experimental grounds for socio-political and socio-natural planning processes. Furthermore, they served as bridges to a promised land, linking remembered collective histories with hopeful visions of the future fulfilling the role of collective memory sites. On all continents, technocrats connected across borders designed and built dams and reservoirs not only to exert political post-colonial influence, but also on behalf of international organizations such as the World Bank, which provided funding for numerous major dam projects until the 1990s. Consequently, these dams also established the framework for distributing water as a precious resource, making them instruments for socio-natural power. In some places, people living and working in the catchment areas of industrialized water bodies willingly accepted such existential interventions in their living environment, despite having democratic participation rights, because large corporations or government development programs promised that they would provide infrastructure connections, essential services, and employment opportunities. The development promises associated with hydropower brought about relocations and displacements in many areas. No exact numbers are available on how many people worldwide had to abandon their homes to make place for a dam in the past century. Project managers and state sponsors rarely provided precise figures and sometimes even distorted them. However, the World Commission on Dams estimates that since the 1930s, dam construction has displaced up to 80 million people worldwide, all of whom have received only inadequate compensation. Governments, dam experts, and energy companies seldom accounted for socio-economic damages, which were primarily borne by impoverished or marginalized groups, instead touting the development promises of affordable energy and water supply to consumers in cities and industry. Thus, dams widened the poverty gap in most countries and regions instead of delivering the progress and prosperity foreseen by planning experts for everyone. In coal-deficient alpine countries such as Italy, Switzerland, and also France, hydropower had already proven itself to be a valuable energy source for post-World War I reconstruction. In the late 19th century, hydroenergy primarily supplied industrial areas along riverbanks. Subsequently, development of high-voltage transmission lines and regional interconnected networks allowed for extensive power distribution. After 1920, artificially created storage lakes became increasingly common. These reservoirs served as potent and internationally connected accumulators, storing and releasing energy as needed. Some industrialized river systems also formed part of broader cross-valley power plant systems. The primary purpose of these alpine reservoirs was not to improve the water management of the surrounding regions, but to deliver peak energy during times of high energy demand. The comprehensive use of hydropower resources relatively early in the alpine countries, such as Switzerland, France, or Italy, led to the displacement of entire villages already during the interwar period. For example, the community of Innertal in the canton of Schwyz in Switzerland had to reluctantly relocate between 1921 and 26 to make way for the Lake Vecchital. From 1928 to 37, 3 hamlets on the plateau of Dauphin in the French department of Isère vanished beneath Lake Chambon. Furthermore, between 1936 and 1940, the 2 storage lakes of Morasco and Agaro in northern Piedmont in Italy submerged houses, farms, and pastures in the high valley of Formazza. However, many of the dam projects planned after 1918 remained incomplete during the interwar years. The global economic crisis, coupled with the Second World War, constrained transnational investments for energy consortia, financial institutions, and construction and engineering companies until 1945. After the Second World War, the war-ravaged alpine countries swiftly returned to the promise of hydropower development. State-owned mixed economy and private power consortia invested in reservoirs intended for hydropower generation. These investments aided in the reconstruction of the domestic industrial sector and ensured the continuation of profitable international energy trade. Moreover, the prices of fossil fuel surged due to the high energy demand and limited supply during and after the war, making investments in both new and existing hydropower projects more appealing. Additionally, the post-1947 Marshall Plan aid funds facilitated the expansion of expensive infrastructure projects. The growth-oriented 1950s, marked by increasing mobility and the expanding in the distribution networks of the emerging consumer society, demanded even more energy, much of which was also flow from hydroelectric power plants. In the Alps, dam construction increased significantly after 1945 until more or less the 1970s, when nuclear power introduced a complementary energy regime. As in other world regions, hardly anyone in the Alps was concerned about the ecological and social costs of expanding hydroenergy in the first decades after the Second World War. Particularly in France, Italy, and Switzerland, the construction of reservoirs led to a progressive loss of agricultural and settlement areas in peripheral mountain valleys. Compared to other large dam projects in countries such as China, the United States, or the Soviet Union, the Alpine hydropower regimes only relocated small villages and hamlets, but did so more frequently under the jurisdiction of numerous national and also regional concession rights. While in both authoritarian democracies such in Italy and France, the centralist resource policies continued. Also in Switzerland, the federal water law from 1916 stayed in place. Here, every canton had its own approval process for hydroelectric power plants, overseen by the federal government that also decided over energy exports and intercantonal interest conflicts. Additionally, annual water charges from power plant operators provided municipal incentives for granting access to hydropower resources. Therefore, Alpine communities often had to perform cost-benefit calculations for relocations and displacement processes, which guided their negotiation strategies. In some cases, these communities were able to prevent power plant projects in Switzerland through inter-municipal collaborations. In federally governed Alpine countries, technocratic experts, planners, governments, representatives, and energy and construction companies thus had to negotiate skillfully to gain access to water resources. The following case studies illustrates how such negotiations took place before and during displacements. In France, following the end of the war, a broad political and economic alliance advocated for a coordinated and efficient approach to rapidly rebuilding the country by harnessing available energy resources and developing the necessary infrastructure. Apart from the nationwide railway network and the coal, oil, and mining sectors, the newly formed Fourth Republic also recognized the untapped industrial potential of hydropower in its Alpine regions. To pursue this potential, Électricité de France, in short EDF, a state-owned energy company born during the Vichy regime, turned its attention to the Digne Plateau in the department of Savoie in 1946, where they identified the ideal conditions for a large-scale hydroelectric power station within a glacial meltwater lake. But the project was not entirely new. Initial designs had been in existence since 1919, and as early as 1920, the private power company Forces Motrices du Rhône had obtained the first concession for a hydropower facility in Tignes. However, previous attempts during the interwar period faltered due to capital shortages, opposition from local residents, and unresolved technical challenges. After the concession changed hands again in 1930, additional plans were drafted by the Comité d'Organisation de l'Énergie électrique, but land purchases offers in Tinje fell through in 1943. And 3 years later, representatives from the EDF visited the resident municipality again. They were operating now under the directive for a project of public interest, urgency, initiated by the communist Minister of Industry, Marcel Paul. The objective was to tap into the existing hydro resources in Tinje, bypassing now the conventional approval process if necessary. Back during the interwar period, both the Vichy Press and the Savoyard Academy of Science and Arts had lent broad support to the inhabitants of Tinje in their struggle against hydropower. They perceived the remote High Valley as a folkloristic, romantic stronghold against encroaching modernity. However, under the National Directive for Postal Reconstruction, directed by Marcel Paul, the village was now under pressure and civil society support for the area waned. The community relied on sparse livestock and dairy farming in the summer, and transhumance and seasonal labor in the winter also grappled with poverty, outmigration, and an aging population. Despite the community's relatively weak bargaining position, EDF representatives continued to face resistance from most of the villagers. For this conflict, however, the energy company bore most of the responsibility, which becomes apparent when we look at the antagonistic actors involved in the project. On the government side of the negotiation table stood technocratic engineers alongside socialist, communist, and also Christian democratic parties, all seeking to reap benefits from the construction of the prestigious dam. In their progressive view, it was difficult to fathom why most of the poor villagers would reject the power plant and the relocation in the name of France's common good. The state's growth-oriented paradigm clashed with the concerns of the Tinjar about an uncertain future beyond their familiar communal coexistence. There was a notable lack also of transparent communication, since EDF did not commit to definitive compensation, did not openly share information about the impending relocation and ongoing negotiations, and also did not offer individual consultations. Furthermore, the properties could hardly be individually compensated or replaced with new buildings, given that the village's economic structure was built on a complex system of shared resources and cooperative living. If the building of the dam disrupted this interconnected way of life, it would be exceedingly challenging to maintain the intricately woven social fabric elsewhere. So when Marcel Paul publicly announced his construction project in 1946, resistance flared up once again in Tinje. Not only were there nearly daily acts of sabotage on the construction site in the form of vandalism and arson, but in the spring of 1946, outraged Tinjar directly attacked construction workers, targeted radio stations, cut down trees, and toppled telephone poles to block or access roads. They even doused construction barracks with gasoline and threw tools into the lake. In addition to such violent incidents, resistance groups also organized demonstrations in the village and presented their concerns to the Prime Minister in Paris. However, the protest groups refused to engage with the sensationalist press of France, as they did not want to recognize any allies in the national media. The disturbances only subsided when state security forces began monitoring the village from 2 vacant hotels. The subsequent relocation was marked by violence and chaos as well. First, those from the village who had agreed to the handover received higher compensation than those who stayed in their homes until the flooding, causing conflict within the community. Second, the government was initially unsure about whether the new settlement should be established above the old Tinje at a hamlet called Hameau de Bois, where only less land-intensive farming was viable, or whether the new residential land should be situated on higher and more distant alpine pastures with even more uncertain prospects. In the end, the government chose the hamlet Hameau de Boisse, providing a new location for around 384 people. The flooding commenced before dawn on March 17, 1952, when the hamlet was already covered by 2 meters of snow, and the village population was unprepared and compelled to leave their homes by a police unit. The last residents abandoned their homes in April 1952, by which time the water had already reached some of the buildings. To prevent the reservoir from becoming a painful memorial for the displaced in the event of future drainage, EDF used dynamite to demolish the old Tigne. Subsequently, the state erected new schools and administrative buildings in the new village center of Boisse at its own expense. Nevertheless, the final compensation amounts had to be determined by a court ruling, as the negotiations between EDF and the relocated families ultimately broke down. In the intermediate years following the inauguration of Lac du Gévril, the newly relocated Tigne saw only limited benefits from hydropower directly. Around a quarter of the original village population left the valley, while the majority settled in the properties constructed by EDF in de Boisse. However, all former Tignards had to wait an additional 3 years for their financial compensation. Furthermore, the economic landscape in the newly established village underwent profound transformation. EDF did expand the road network for its construction site, but the state did not replace the old railway line, resulting in new transportation connections, primarily catering to more expensive automobile traffic. While the dam construction site initially created short-term jobs locally and brought migrant workers to the valley, once the reservoir was filled and the turbines were operational, the demand for labor dwindled as EDF employees moved on to the next dam project. The economic benefits from those who remained in the valley only materialized in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when the once sparsely visited High Valley evolved into a prominent winter sport destination. The prior presence of EDF proved advantageous in this transformation, as their abandoned infrastructure, including construction workers' accommodations, could be repurposed into a holiday community. This repurposing led to the development of numerous hotels, chalets, and ski resorts catering to winter tourism. The number of second homes increased fivefold between 1962 and 68, mirroring the municipality's population, the majority of whom now worked in the hospitality industry. Agriculture all but disappeared from the valley. In 1946, 73 of all valley residents were still engaged in the primary sector, but by 1954, this number had dropped to 24%, and ultimately reaching a mere 3% in 1968. In Italy, the central government also had a keen interest in the water resources of its alpine regions, aiming to stabilize the nation's energy balance, which the war had disrupted. However, there were distinct differences in how the Italian government managed the different provinces. While the government granted the Aosta Valley a 99-year concession to independently administer its own hydro resources, the first autonomy statute of Trentino South Tyrol of 1948 reaffirmed Rome's authority over the province. The Ministry of Public Works in Rome thus continued to grant concessions. The provincial government of Trentino South Tyrol had only an advisory role and could object to projects if it wanted to use them for captive purposes. As a result, municipalities were not involved in negotiations when new concessions requests for the remote border province reached Rome. These unequal rights to national water resources represent a significant continuity in the various Italian government systems of the 20th century. The water law was initially established in 1916 by the then Minister of Public Works, Ivanoe Bonomi, was expanded during Mussolini's regime and remained in effect during the post-war Republican government. Several reservoir projects that private energy companies had designed or partially initiated in the interwar period were only completed after 1945. As a result, the forceful fascist resource policy became integrated into the energy sector of Republican Italy. In the 1940s, the first major dam project in Trentino, South Tyrol was completed on the Rhenian Pass near the Austrian border. Various designs for this project had been proposed since 1920, but the project remained incomplete during the interwar period due to insufficient funding. The initial project plans indicated that the reservoir would be situated on the territories of the two villages, Rhenian and Graun. Historically, these two settlements played crucial roles as stopping points for transalpine passenger, freight, and postal traffic, with flourishing craftsmanship and a thriving hospitality sector. However, starting in the 19th century, both villages experienced a decline due to wars, faster transportation routes, protectionist trade restrictions, and subsequent labor shortages, leading to emigration. So between 1838 and 1921, the population of these villages halved, and at times even children aged 7 to 14 had to emigrate to southern Germany to work as laborers in industry, agriculture, or private households. Local agriculture relied on the surrounding alpine pastures for livestock and crop cultivation, while the forest and the Etsch River, which originated in the municipal area, provided essential resources. Notably, the farms in Graun and Rhenian were rarely operated by only single families, instead involving multiple parties that supplemented their income with various crafts. During the Second World War, the two communities faced a renewed threat when the Società Elettrica Alto Adige received a concession from the Ministry of Public Works in Rome in 1940, initiating the displacement intended for the reservoir. However, the two-year occupation of Trentino, South Tyrol by Nazi Germany, which had planned to build a railway connection over the Rhenian Pass, further delayed the reservoir project. After the war, the construction rights were eventually transferred to the Milanese chemical company Montecatini, which had been building and operating hydropower plants in South Tyrol for its manufacturing facilities since around 1925. However, the conglomerate also did not have sufficient funds for the costly dam project with the relocation and reconstruction of the two villages. Montecatini finally secured financing in 1947 through a government loan and a participation agreement by the Swiss energy holding company Elektrowatt. The resistance from the affected villages was fierce. The early project designs from the interwar period triggered objections from the fishing industry, agriculture, and communities dependent on drinking water. And similarly, these new designs ignited significant protests. As with the Lac du Gevril in Tignes, a resistance movement mobilized in Rhenian and Graun, also backed by a majority of the local population, against the relocation announced in the regional press in 1946. The affected village communities, for instance, commissioned geological assessment questioning the safety of the planned dam's location, filed appeals against the relocation, inadequate compensation or potential dam breaches in German language regional newspapers, and also formed relevant committees. Moreover, a delegation consisting of the mayor of Graun, the local priest, and the bishop of Brixen approached Pope Pius XII in 1947 to request protection for the affected communities, but their appeal was in vain. Montecatini never directly negotiated with the residents of Rhenian and Graun, but only with the Consorzio di Comuni e delle Province del Trentino Alto Adige, which had been established under the fascist regime. Under the first autonomy statute of 1948, Trentino-South Tyrol had no elected political representation for the province, and decision-making that would have been equitable for all parties thus was not achieved. When the reservoir was finished in the summer of 1950, its construction led to the drowning of around 120 farms. Only a few of the displaced families moved into one of the residential buildings constructed by Montecatini on the shore of the reservoir. The unsuccessful resistance in Graun and Rheschen can be attributed to several factors. First, Montecatini's lack of willingness to negotiate played a significant role, as it left property owners uncertain until the late 1940s about when they had to leave their homes due to the construction of the reservoir. This lack of empathy provoked conflicts between villagers and concessionaries, not only in Val d'Isère but also in the upper Vinschgau region. Communication between the German-speaking community and the Italian-speaking regulatory authorities in Rome had already failed during the early project years, because any official information about the relocation reached the German-speaking village in Italian, and the officials appointed by the fascist regime never reported any objections from Graun and Rheschen to their superiors in Rome. Furthermore, most of the villagers who chose to move away during the so-called option agreement of 1939 already assumed that they would be entitled to real estate beyond the Italian border, as promised by Hitler and Mussolini. Therefore, they did not raise objections to the announced relocation in 1946, and when the option was revealed as a disastrous miscalculation by the two dictators, it was already too late for effective resistance against the Rheschen Reservoir project. The resentment of the village increased further when the concessionary not only paid the promised compensation funds too late, but also began building the new settlement in the spring of 1950, forcing some of the relocated families to live in barracks for several years. As in French Tignes, the reservoir in Rheschen and Graun also tore apart the social fabric of the people living within its catchment area. Intensive land-based agriculture was no longer viable, and the families relocated to the lakeside had to build up a new existence beyond accustomed socio-economic structures. The property compensation provided by Montecatini, based solely on the market value at the time, so it could hardly compensate for the loss of a community-based economic system. This insufficient compensation was especially relevant for those engaged in trade and commerce, as the Milan-based industrial company never adequately compensated for the lost clientele. Similar to the Val d'Isère and Tignes, winter tourism in the Rheschen Pass area opened up new development prospects during the 1950s. The ski resort of Schöneben expanded until the 1980s and provided numerous income opportunities in the valley, particularly in the hospitality sector and cable car operations. Unlike in France and Italy, energy companies in Switzerland did not need to apply for concessions from the central government. Instead, they had to approach various administrative authorities depending on each canton. In the canton of Grisons, the rights to water resources were transferred to territorial municipalities after 1906, where the voting residence councils regulated access to rivers and lakes. The abundance of water resources in this mountainous canton quickly drew the attention of regional power consumers as hydroelectricity gained popularity. The emergence of high-voltage power lines and nationwide grid led to supra-regional power companies incorporating Grisons into their expansion strategies. The compensation for the white coal also extended to the Julio Valley in the Bündner Oberalpstein in Grisons, where companies from Zurich secured the first reservoir concessions from the municipality of Marmorera in 1913. After several failed project proposals, the submission by the Zurich City Electrical Company, in short EWZ, for an earth-filled dam finally succeeded in 1948. And 6 years later, the entire plateau, including 29 residential houses, 41 stables, 4 commercial buildings, a church, and 5 public buildings, had disappeared beneath the water. Walter Pfisto, who served as EWZ's appointed negotiator, arrived in Marmorera in 1948, along with representatives from the region. Their purpose was to negotiate the concession with the resident council. Upon his arrival, Pfisto encountered a favorable starting point. The two hamlets relied on agriculture, forestry, road construction, and tourism in the neighboring Engadin. But they suffered also from significant emigration and aging population and poverty. The canton had repeatedly placed the debt-ridden municipality under trusteeship, since it lost its significance as a well-frequented transit point due to the construction of the Albula Railway between 1888 and 1903. Economic geographic studies from the Federal University in Zurich and also articles from Heritage Conservation confirmed the poverty of the village. Additionally, the EWZ delegation led by Pfisto demonstrated astute negotiation tactics. They directly engaged with individual property owners and conducted negotiations for the property transfer behind closed doors, even before the municipal assembly could deliberate on the concession in October 1948. Pfisto allegedly made his purchase offer for the properties contingent on the residents' support for the reservoir project during the town meeting. He was also said to have claimed that he had offered a considerably lower property transfer fee to farmers' neighbors. Internal EWZ documents reveal that Pfisto and his local representatives not only possessed detailed knowledge of the income situations of the villagers, but also closely observed and actively influenced the composition of the municipal commission. As a result, when the villagers gathered at the town hotel, EWZ had already acquired all the land on the valley floor, including the properties on it. EWZ had also secured the support of the municipal assembly, as the eligible voters at the meeting predominantly approved the concession. Yet, not all community members were permitted to vote on the purchase of their village. Until 1972, the canton of Grisons did not grant women the right to vote. Property owners residing outside the municipality were also denied the right to participate in the decision. The construction of the reservoir, resulting from a deliberate negotiation strategy and the limited opportunities for community participation, did not attract criticism in Grisons or Switzerland. For the canton, the indebted and economically challenged municipality primarily represented a financial burden that the reservoir was expected to alleviate by generating concession fees and annual water royalties. Additionally, Marmorera was meant to serve as a nationwide showcase for the development of cantonal hydroelectricity, as stated by former cantonal councillor Ettore Tenkio in the 1990s. He further stated that Ernst Nobs, the then head of Federal Department of Finance and Customs, only wanted to provide financial reconstruction aid from the federal government if the canton of Grisons independently developed its water resources. The Federal Council in Bern thus indirectly applied pressure on the communal decision process as well. In Zurich, where also Elektrowatt was headquartered, the Regency debacle led to a heated public discussion. Therefore, EWZ prudently demolished the houses of Marmorera and the village's chapel before the storage lake was filled. Unlike in Regen, an exposed church tower was not to serve as a monument to a community sacrificed for the national energy industry. In 1954, around 24 families had to vacate their homes, with a few relocating to newly built and nearby New Marmorera, while most sought new homes outside the valley. In the following years, the reservoir was inaugurated and commenced operations. Life in Marmorera was based on the collective use of goods and resources, as it was in Resen and Tinje. But the divided Marmorera village here did not reunite after the flooding. Some families were able to successfully establish a new life outside the valley and, in hindsight, saw it as a gain, while others struggled with the unfamiliar living conditions at new places. This latter group painfully remembered the life in old Marmorera, which, although poor and modest, was frugal and untroubled. The windfall from Zurich did not prevent New Marmorera from being placed under trusteeship again in the following years. The still internally divided community therefore hardly profited from the energy trade, and unlike Tinje and Resen, no tourist facilities were developed around the reservoir. The history of the reservoirs in Tinje, Resen and Marmorera provides an overview of the political structures of the energy industries, which dictated the more or less voluntary resettlement of village communities in the Alps after 1945. In France, resettlements occurred due to the centralized dictate of a nationalized energy sector. In Italy, displacements also followed the order of a government authority, but in the interest of a private energy industry. And finally, in federal Switzerland, resettlements were decided at the municipal level in the interest of public-private power consortia. While dams and their infrastructural networks promised development and addressed social, political, and economic connectivity and service needs, they also brought about expropriations and displacements. In the Central Alps, initiatives to develop hydroelectric power dating back at least to the interwar period led to the modernization of infrastructure in remote catchment areas. Yet, the socio-economic concerns and needs of the mountain population were basically secondary, and if a valley wanted to benefit from the new connections, it had to align its communal life according to national priorities. The progress promised by technocracy in peripheral alpine communities thus turned out to be a mere byproduct of externally driven resource and energy policy. The often overlooked stories of submerged villages also serve as a warning for sustainable energy policies. Achieving such an energy transition necessitates not only the use of renewable resources, but also the implementation of a socially equitable distribution system. An equitable approach ensures that marginalized regions used for resource extraction are not subjected to the unilateral decisions of economically powerful metropolitan areas. So the stories of displacement caused by hydropower in the Alps emphasize the importance of local acceptance of power plants and resource extraction sites when thinking about environmental justice and energy policies. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you for this interesting presentation. I think it's kind of introduction to all the presentations that are coming in this session. And I suggest if you have any questions for Sebastian about what he presented, to just ask him. Yes, Leo?
I have one question. really enjoyed your lecture. In France, in the case of France, you told us that the communists, socialists, and Christians stood fairly behind this project. But how about in Italy, especially the resistance against this dam? Were any politicians, political parties involved? What was their opinion? Anyway, thank you.
This really depends on the province where the dams were planned. In Trentino, South Tyrol, especially in South Tyrol, you had a German-speaking majority with regional parties that were generally against Italy and against parties from Italy and everything that came from the southern provinces. But interestingly enough, they weren't against hydropower per se. So there were also a few dams built in Trentino, South Tyrol with with the help of provincial conglomerates, which also included resettlements. So I think what's interesting, and you see the same thing also in France, that behind also all those political parties and worldviews, you have this technocratic ideology for energy expansion and resource extraction. So it didn't really was important which party you belong to. But in other provinces in Italy, for example, in northern Veneto, where you had dam project, for example, like Vajont, the famous case. There was a horrible accident in 1963. When a whole mountain slide fell into the storage lake and killed the whole village in one night. And there you had regional socialist politicians who really spoke out against the dam project before the catastrophe occurred. So,
but that was in 60s, right?
63, after the nationalization, at the same time of like the nationalization of the Italian energy sector. So there you had some socialist politicians who spoke up against those hydro infrastructures that were planned by big conglomerates.
Okay. Anything else? Any comments? I think it will be easier. Maybe we planned for this debate immediately after your presentation, but I think it will be much easier if we do it after we hear all the other presentations in this panel, because you have similar topics and there's going to be much more to think about from different perspectives. So if there is no one else, I would suggest that we take a break, and then after the presentations Marta? Žarko. Žarko, okay.
I just would like to give a comment. What I really found very interesting is that Sebastian emphasized one very important fact, not only for the future creation of the environmental policy, but for us as a historian as well, and that is that every development, every progress, however we consider it, has a price. The only question in society is who is going to pay the price. Is this price going to be dispersed through the society on one reasonable level, or it is going to be concentrated only on one community, as you described in your three cases? And maybe you started, you probably are still doing your research in this way. When this social costs became a question of real discussion, not just discussion as you showed us that there is a strong attempt just to minimize the cost as much as possible regarding the local community. Is this in 60s? Is this in 70s? And where the initiative came from the local communities or from the general consciousness of the society that these costs are unbearable for local communities?
Mm-hmm. That depends also on the decade where the projects were discussed and negotiated. In the 50s, there were less mobilization nationwide with environmental movements, for example. It's something that came up more in the 70s. So you have protests by single villages in the 40s and 1950s. That was not easy for them to mobilize on a intercommunal level. So they really quite often stood for their alone. But in Switzerland, you have some cases. In central Switzerland, was in canton of Uri, or also in Grisons, Rheinwald, were quite famous and touristically high frequented valleys were affected. And then you had the heritage conservation movement, who spoke also out against the project because they were afraid that the landscape of national value would get lost. So there we had some kind of nationwide mobilization. But in the after-war years, there was more this belief in progress and technocratic and consumer society, with a high energy demand, and so that was more seen as a victims in the name of the national progress. There was more the narrative, and also the villages. I mean, it's something that I also that I find in many cases, which is perhaps also different than, for example, when you have big projects in colonial regions or also in imperial states, Soviet Union. It wasn't always that the region, that the valley lost everything. It was in some cases also cost-benefit calculations, and some valley also gained out of those infrastructure. And so, if you visit nowadays villages or valleys where there is a dam and where there was a resettlement higher up in the valley, the villages they're quite positive again. They remember it as a positive thing because the streets and the railway lines and all those new infrastructures that came with it, hydropower, they also opened up development for the valleys. So it's every case needs to be examined really closely. And
Okay, Mita.
I think it would be interesting to make a comparison with the three projects that you presented with the situation on the Socha River, where the plants were built before the war. And I think that no resettlement were actually needed, but there was, of course, a huge loss of agricultural land, which was not in abundance even before, and it was basically paid on market price. The compensations were paid in base of a market price of what was for a pasture, a valuable piece of land for the Italian electricity company. It was paid like a miserable compensation. But it had also a strong ideological component to bring, from the fascist point of view, to bring prosperity and development on a Slovenian-speaking territory, barbaric, underdeveloped, to bring light in all sense of the. So maybe this ideological point of view was as much as important as the economic, but it was before the Second World War.
Yes, I mean, first thing, if you look not only at resettlements but also where agricultural land was lost due to dam building, the social cost there, the picture really broadens up in the whole Alpine region, but because everywhere where you have a storage lake, there was land that was in use before. You don't have a wilderness in the Alps. It was always a cultural used landscape. So you have really a lot of valleys where pastures got lost. Yes, and and the fascism, this ideology viewpoint was quite important. In many valleys, also in South Tyrol, where you had a German-speaking majority, the cultivation was set to Italianization of a German-speaking valley, but also, for example, in Piedmont, where you have the Valso communities, was also a minority that spoke German, was also seen as a more Swiss tribe people, and so we cultivate those. And this ideology of bringing fascist modernities into those remote valleys with the big construction sites and infrastructure was very common, but also continued after 1945. This was really it's a continuity that you have in the Italian energy sectors, that many dams were built after the war with the same viewpoint that we have to that the Italians had to cultivate those peripheral valleys. So this was really it's quite important for here.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Any more comments or questions? Okay, so I would like to invite you downstairs to take a break and to chat some more, and then we will proceed with other presentations. Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you very much. Okay.